This Lent, we're exploring who killed Jesus.
Many people are convinced that they know the answers.
But we've gathered 16 suspects as we retrace the events of Holy Week in this special 6-week podcast.
With your help, we'll discover who really killed Jesus.
This podcast is a production of ProgressiveChristianity.org
and University Christian Church, San Diego.
I'm Caleb Lines.
And I'm Marshela Salgado.
This is Who Killed Jesus, a true crime podcast, Episode 6, Silent Saturday and Easter Sunday. Welcome back to Who Killed Jesus, where we have been retracing the events of Holy Week to discover who really killed Jesus, why, and what that means for us today. So, since this is our final episode, let's go back and retrace these events of Holy Week very quickly. On Palm Sunday, we see Jesus entering into Jerusalem, staging a counter-protest against Roman imperialism. Then, on Holy Monday, Jesus and his disciples go into the temple and they stage a protest against the religious establishment, the purity system, and particularly those who are collaborating with Rome. On Teaching Tuesday, Jesus goes back to the temple, this time in the courtyard, and teaches this message that is both anti-imperial and anti-religious establishment. On Women's Wednesday, we see a woman anointing Jesus as the Messiah, as the king in the reign of God. And then we see Judas deciding that this is all too radical, and he decides to betray Jesus. Then on Maundy Thursday, we get this Passover meal where Jesus tells his disciples to remember him and to continue the act of tabling to break down barriers. And on Good Friday, Jesus is finally executed. And we are now to the events of Silent Saturday. So, that's a lot, Marshela.
It is a lot. But we're here in the end.
We're here in the end. And I mean, Marshela, is there really any wonder why Jesus ended up on the cross with all of that stuff?
Yeah. He was really pushing buttons, and they were also pushing back. And just a lot going on that week. But, a lot.
a lot. So that means that there were also a lot of suspects.
Mm-hmm.
Could you kind of go over who the suspects were and maybe why we chose some of those suspects?
Yeah. Well, first is the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. And obviously, they were living under the dominance of the Roman Empire. That was the empire that they were living under. And along with that, we have Pontius Pilate, who he didn't live in Jerusalem at the time. He purposely would come in during the big Jewish festivals. And it was a big sign that the Roman Empire was trying to make. Like, we're watching you. We know that you've got stuff going on. And as we'd mentioned before, Passover being, the biggest celebration, but also the significance of Passover, which is the time when the Israelites were set free. So freedom, it's a good time if you want to make revolution and create something, and Passover would be a good one because there's significance behind that. So, so that, those two. With that is the Sanhedrin. Now, with the Sanhedrin, I'm trying to think. Did we talk about? I don't know how much we really talk about the Sanhedrin in the process of what happened, the events of Friday, Thursday, in church. But we did talk about that a little bit in previous episodes. Yeah. The big one, Jews. Mm-hmm. Jews have been accused of being the ones to crucify Jesus over time. And unfortunately, that is very, very unfortunate because it has led to anti-Semitism. And yes, there were Jewish leaders involved in what happened during Holy Week and in, condemning Jesus and fighting back, pushing those buttons back and trying to corner him. But as a whole, Jesus's followers and Jesus himself, reminder, were Jewish. Mm-hmm. This is very significant. Important. And last week we didn't really mention it, but a lot of times over the centuries, the story has evolved that the same people who followed Jesus were the ones that condemned him to the cross. And I do want to mention that those followers were most likely not present when Jesus was stripped and the thorn of crowns was thrown on his head, because it happened in a private courtyard, right? It happened in Herod's court. Was it Herod?
Yeah, the courtyard of Herod of Herod the Great's palace, where Pilate was likely staying.
Right. So it was a private residence. It's not, I mean, invitation only.
Yes.
Like you had to be invited to be there. And most likely the peasants that were following Jesus, the people that were following Jesus, not all of them were peasants. Also, I do have to say that. But the people who followed Jesus were not the people that were invited there. So that in and of itself, the story kind of falls apart there. But we have the Sadducees and Pharisees, the leaders that were like pushing Jesus's buttons and trying to back him into a corner. Original sin, we do talk about, this all happened because Adam and Eve, fell apart in the garden and went against Jesus. And hand in hand with that would be God. Like that this is a story like because of Adam and Eve, God had no choice but to, condemn his son to the cross for our sake. And I like this one, the Republican Party. And you also had said U.S. politics with that. Because there's a lot of similarities that we've talked about, a lot of parallels of what was happening with the Roman Empire and what's happening right now in the U.S. and what has happened over decades. Again, another one, my personal sin. This again ties back into God, right? Like I am just, I was born not good. And, my sin at the time, 18 months old. Like
all the wrongdoing you could have done.
All my wrongdoing, yes. And because of that, Jesus had to die so that I can be saved from my personal sin. Courtney Love, that was thrown out there by someone near and dear to me the very first week when you asked, who killed Jesus. Just for the sake of my daughter and myself, we're just keeping Courtney Love on the radar. We want to reopen the Kurt Cobain case. Who killed Kurt Cobain? So
that's the next podcast.
That's the next podcast. I'm sure we can find some good theology in there. Of course, Judas. Judas betrays Jesus. He is the disciple that betrays Jesus, leads the Roman guards to Jesus so that they can arrest him. We all know the story of Judas. And with Judas comes greed. Judas wanted money or, the greed of the people. So greed. Next, Jesus's disciples. We don't hear about that as much. We hear that they deny him. But does that mean that they were complicit in what happened? That's a question. But the disciples, Caiaphas, again, a name that we don't hear very often. He's mentioned very, very quickly. And then last of all, the Roman emperor, the Roman emperor Tiberius. Yeah. So I think that goes hand in hand with the Roman Empire. Yeah. But within the Roman Empire, there were strategic figures. And, some may have washed their hands of it. Some may have said, whatever, y'all are being ridiculous, but go for it, so it's a lot.
That is a lot. And so we did promise to land somewhere on who killed Jesus today. And so maybe we should eliminate suspects.
Okay. Oh, I like that.
And see who we're left with.
Okay.
So maybe we could start by eliminating Courtney Love. This one.
Yeah. Reopen that case, Kurt Cobain. I'll let her go.
Okay, we'll let her go on this one, and she can be the subject of a future podcast.
Perfect.
So I think, how do you feel about letting God off the hook for this one?
That was going to be my next suggestion. I don't think God had anything to do with this. I don't think there was a greater plan. I think this book clearly states it, along with a lot of other, theological perspectives. This was not part of God's plan.
I think that's good. And maybe tied into that are two other suspects, which are original sin and personal sin, that I think through the events of Holy Week, we can see pretty clearly that there was a series of events that led to Jesus's crucifixion. We also, I think, have talked pretty extensively about how this notion of Jesus as an atonement came later. That the whole doctrine of original sin came about 3 centuries later after Jesus' death. If Jesus were hanging on the cross and someone said, "Oh, thank you for dying for original sin, he wouldn't have known what that meant because that concept hadn't been invented yet.
Right.
So I think that one probably we can go ahead and cross out, along with personal sin. We saw last week that the whole notion of Jesus as atonement for our sins came along in the 11th century. So it would have been about a millennium before Jesus would have found out about that idea.
Wow.
So he wouldn't have known about that either.
Yeah.
So I think this whole notion that God killed Jesus for our sins is something that just is not historical. It just was a later theological development. So I think we can go ahead and take God off.
Good.
Who else would you like to eliminate?
Let me see. Well, I think I was very clear earlier when I was talking about the Jews. Like, if we're talking about the Jews as a whole people, at the time, and unfortunately also through modern times, which, people still like, that's where a lot of anti-Semitism happened, and an excuse also, for World War II was one of the many reasons, you killed Jesus. So I think Jews as a whole people. Yeah.
That's very significant. And I think part of this is understanding biblical history and understanding that the Gospel of John, which is where a lot of the anti-Semitism comes from, comes because of the context in which that gospel was written, where the community 60 years after Jesus' crucifixion was beginning to leave the synagogue. And that's what all of that was about. Right. So as you so aptly pointed out, Jesus was Jewish. His followers were Jewish.
Right.
And so blaming the Jews for Jesus and for his crucifixion is just nonsensical. It doesn't make any sense.
Yep.
And so I think we can probably go ahead and eliminate Judas as well. Or, sorry, Jews as well. I think we should put a pin in the Republican Party, U.S. politics, and come back to that later. But I think that they obviously didn't actually kill Jesus.
Republicans did not exist. The U.S. did not exist.
Right.
But there's something there in terms of politics, probably that we can glean from. Yeah.
Now, in terms of our remaining suspects, I think that there's something to be said for the remaining suspects here.
Okay. I have a question.
Yeah.
Caiaphas. I was a little fascinated with him because it's not a name we hear so often.
Yeah.
What do you think about him as a suspect?
I think that Caiaphas is part of the problem. And I think that's one thing that we really learn in walking through the events of the last week is that there were a lot of people who were involved because of the way domination systems are built. That domination systems are built to empower those who go along with imperialism. And so I think that's what we find through a lot of our remaining suspects.
Right.
So I think Caiaphas was a part of the collaborators with Rome. That there is no doubt that at the end of the day, it was imperialism that killed Jesus. But there were a lot of people who were involved in that.
Right. Okay.
And so Caiaphas was one of the local collaborators with Rome. He was complicit in Roman action. He was complicit in Roman oppression. And he was complicit because he wanted to stay in power, but also because he wanted to protect his people.
Right.
And he had a delicate balance that he had to achieve, which was to protect his people and also not offend the Roman Empire.
Right. He was towing a fine line.
He really was.
And Jesus most likely appeared as not an easy one to hand over, but just, here, like, for the sake of my people and peace, like what they would consider peace. Here's something, I'll throw you a bone and I'll take care of it, Yeah.
I think he was involved in that way. That in terms of complicity, I mean, some people got murdered by the Roman Empire, and it was a greater good kind of argument.
Right.
That that the people who were going to cause problems got crucified, and I think Caiaphas did probably try to protect the people he could and try to achieve a working balance with the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
I think
Definitely.
in terms of kind of collaborators too, we see people who are involved in the temple cult, including
Mm-hmm.
Pharisees and Sadducees. And
Right.
there's an argument that while Pharisees are the primary antagonists of the New Testament, that they were also probably the primary antagonists when the Gospels were written and not when Jesus
Mm-hmm.
was actually in ministry. And
Okay.
so that
Right.
gospel writers likely reinterpreted that, although Pharisees did care about like a strict adherence to the purity system. And Jesus was confronting that. That's one of
Mm-hmm.
the things he was doing in the temple, as we've discussed. But the Sadducees were really the ones who were in charge of the temple. And Jesus seemed to have a real problem
Mm-hmm.
with the way that the temple was operating.
Yeah.
But I think primarily because they were collaborating with Rome.
Right.
And
Right.
so I don't think Pharisees and Sadducees get off the hook
No.
for this.
Yes, I agree. And that's where, they were the Jewish leaders and
Mhm.
the religious leaders at the time. Um, so that's where, if we they definitely collaborated, I
They
think. And
yes.
they were the ones pushing buttons. They were the ones trying to back him into a corner. But also trying to do it in such a way that, they didn't ruffle his followers or other people's feathers too much, but also just kind of like, here you go,
Yeah.
just they were trying to back him into a corner. That's very clear on Teaching Tuesday.
Yes, and they believed things that Jesus just wasn't comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
That they really believed in the purity system and
Right.
Jesus really didn't. And so that was a disagreement that was a part of what happened during Jesus's ministry and
Mm-hmm.
during Holy Week. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't think the Pharisees and the Sadducees get off the hook. I also think the Sanhedrin, whatever that council of Jewish leaders was, religious leaders was, that they were likely a part of what was happening.
Right.
That however that happened, clearly the religious establishment was
Mm-hmm.
not happy with Jesus. And so the council of leaders, I think, was involved in
Mm-hmm.
all of that.
Okay.
But a caveat to that is that they didn't decide to execute Jesus.
Right. Right.
As we've said before, if they had decided to execute Jesus, which
Uh-huh.
they could have, I mean, he
Right.
was staged a demonstration in the temple, right?
Mm-hmm.
They could have decided that.
Yeah.
They would have executed him by stoning.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's fair to say that there was at least tension between Jesus and the religious establishment,
Right.
that there was something going on there,
Yeah.
but that they did not.
Right.
They did not kill him.
And I think just to emphasize that point, so stoning was
Yeah.
their method of
Yes.
execution, whereas the cross, as we've read and we know, was how the Roman Empire executed Jesus. So I think
Yeah.
that is a very important point, that stoning wasn't Rome's way of killing.
Yeah, right. That's right. That stoning was not Rome's way of killing, and that crucifixion was not the religious establishment,
Mhm.
their method of execution.
Mhm.
And so there is no way that they were responsible. And that's important to say because I hear that all the time.
Mhm.
That Jews killed Jesus, and Romans were like the puppets of
Mm.
Jewish leaders. Well,
Whoa.
that just simply is not true. That
Yeah.
is not historical. An oppressed people cannot tell the Roman Empire what to do.
Right.
That just does not happen.
Yeah.
So I think that Emperor Tiberius was certainly interested in quelling any forms of sedition.
Mhm.
And that is just the nature of imperialism, that
Right.
people who are dangerous, you
Mhm.
put down. So there was Roman policy to do
Mhm.
that. So in that way, uh, Emperor Tiberius was involved. I think the Roman Empire is involved, right?
Okay.
Because it is the Roman policy to put
Mhm.
down acts of sedition. I think, though, ultimately, even though Caiaphas is let off the hook in the
Mhm.
Gospels,
Mhm.
and in one Gospel washes his hands of the whole
Right.
thing,
Right.
that I don't think that's accurate.
Mhm.
That Pilate is the governor.
Mhm.
He's the one who comes in.
Okay.
He's the one who, is marching in on Palm Sunday and Jesus on the other side of town. Ultimately, it's Pilate's decision.
Mhm.
Pilate decides
Mhm.
that Jesus is getting crucified. We've already
Right.
talked about how the whole thing with Barabbas isn't historical. And I
Right,
think
right.
maybe this is the most important thing for us to say, that you cannot go to the Gospels and look at those accounts as if they reflect real history,
Exactly. Yeah.
because they just
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah.
They are interpretive. They are
Mhm.
theological interpretive works.
Mhm.
And so I think that, yes, while the remaining folks, Judas probably played a role,
Mhm.
it's you could argue that Judas is symbolic, right,
Right.
for us.
Well, realistically, I believe there really is no historical record of a Judas.
Mhm.
So it could be, a figure that they use to aid the story,
Yeah.
moving it along or adding to it. Or maybe there really was one of Jesus's followers. It doesn't have
Yeah.
to be the direct 12. It could be any who, for fear of their own life, their own safety, decided, maybe it's best I turn him in. So there is possibility, but there is no actual historical record other than the story we read in the Bible.
Right, of Judas. So who knows, really?
Hmm.
But certainly in the narrative, he plays a role
Right.
of turning him over, and I think that is, at least, no matter if he existed or not, the
Hmm.
question for us is: Are we following Jesus, or are we betraying Jesus? The principles of
Right.
Jesus,
Right.
and is Judas motivated by greed or
Hmm.
fear or
Hmm.
whatever? I think we're supposed to ask: Are we being motivated by those?
Right.
And the
Right.
same with disciples who ultimately aren't there for Jesus.
Right.
I think the
The male
question,
disciples.
the male disciples, that's a great point, because the female disciples are there
Right.
and
Right.
are funding the ministry, or at the cross.
Hmm.
And so, which disciples are we? I
Right.
think is one of their most important roles in
Yeah.
the passion narrative.
Yeah.
So I think, tell me how you feel about this, Marshella. I think that if we have to say what really happened to Jesus,
Hmm.
who really killed Jesus,
Hmm.
that it's Pilate on behalf of the Roman Empire,
Hmm.
with the consent of the collaborators who are ultimately interested in keeping the peace between Rome and Judea, and keeping their positions of power.
Right.
What do you think about that?
I think I agree. I agree. The story, I feel the way that they've walked us through it
Yeah.
over the last week, is very clear that
Mm,
it wasn't just one suspect, or suspect being the whole
mm,
empire, Roman
mhm,
Empire. I do believe that there were multiple people who
mm,
collaborated in it.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, well, that's who
Wow.
killed Jesus. But I think a really significant question remains, Marcella,
Yes.
and that's, what does it mean? And I think what it means is answered by the events of Silent Saturday and Easter Sunday. So let's take a quick break, come back, and talk about what all of this means.
Who Killed Jesus, a true crime podcast, is a special 6-week exploration of who really killed Jesus and why.
This podcast is brought to you by ProgressiveChristianity.org, celebrating 30 years of reclaiming Jesus' original message of justice, peace, and liberation, while proclaiming an intellectually honest Christianity.
And University Christian Church, San Diego, an authentic, inclusive, and progressive congregation in the heart of San Diego's Hillcrest neighborhood that declares God's love for all people.
Welcome back to Who Killed Jesus, where we are talking about what Jesus' death really means. And I think it's explained through the events of Silent Saturday and Easter Sunday. So, Marshella, Silent Saturday. Have you ever done much to observe Saturday in Holy
No.
Week?
Easter egg hunts,
Yeah.
getting ready for Easter. We're probably dying eggs, but no, church-wise, nothing. Haven't heard anything happening on Saturdays usually. Yeah. Maybe, I do appreciate, at our church, at University Christian Church, the prayer vigil
Yeah.
continues during that time. And I do appreciate that, but it wasn't until I came here that
Yeah.
anything ever happened on a Saturday.
Now, you taught me a phrase a year or two ago, and that's tomb time.
Oh, yes.
Is there something significant about tomb time?
Yes, and that actually is a term that I heard from my friend Andrea Canales, and it's in terms of grief,
Mm,
grief or just even like when there's too much going on. Like look at us right now as a society, we're overwhelmed. We're just like there's so much going on, um, and sometimes we need that tomb time to process what's
yeah.
happened. It's a time to reflect, to sit quietly, and just work through some of the stuff. And sometimes, it's not like going to therapy, going to talk to a friend, going to, active stuff. It's
Yeah.
really just quieting and reflection and trying to figure out, and reflecting on like what's happened. So I love that,
Yeah.
especially now after going through the last week and really seeing all these events in order. And like I keep saying, it's a lot, and it really is a lot.
Mm.
So that tomb time might be very important.
Yeah, and I think that probably if we had to guess historically what happened on Saturday, the processing day.
Mhm.
You've just gone through these events and you've seen your leader crucified.
Yeah.
That is a day that is both overwhelming,
Mhm.
emotionally and in terms of, what it is that's next. It's, I think, a
Mhm.
day where you can't really process, or
Right.
you're trying to process and you can't really think through logically
Yeah.
what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
And so I think it's implied that maybe that's what's happening on Saturday, that it is
Yeah.
silent. And I think it's important to say that in the Gospel of Mark, there is literal silence. There is
Nothing.
nothing about Saturday.
Says
So
nothing about Saturday.
Mark
Yeah.
has really detailed the events of Holy Week, right? We've
Mhm.
gotten a day by day recounting,
Yeah.
and there's nothing
Yeah.
on Saturday.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot that, over time has
Mhm.
developed assumptions, a lot of assumptions on what happened to Jesus. Did he go down into, Hades or
Yeah.
hell or,
Yeah.
was he in limbo? Was he, I mean,
Yeah.
there are so many ideas that have come, but they're all assumptions, and none of them happened, were even like, 40 years after Jesus'
Yeah.
crucifixion. None of them are mentioned in Mark at
Yes.
all, so they're again assumptions, I think.
That's a great point. Yeah, the harrowing of hell, as it's often called, as Jesus goes down into hell and then liberates people from hell. That's a theological development much later, but there is some debate about. He certainly didn't go into hell because that concept uh, probably wasn't a concept that Jesus believed in.
Mhm.
He didn't necessarily talk about hell. He talked about Gehenna, as we've mentioned, the
Right. And Jewish
literal place.
tradition didn't
Right.
believe in hell, which is why Jesus wouldn't have.
Right. With the exception of there was a developing idea for people who had been exposed to some Hellenistic culture, but for
Mhm.
by and large, right, people didn't believe in an afterlife. And they
Mhm.
did believe in Sheol, which was just
Mhm.
the place where dead souls were, but not like they were living or in mansions or pits of fire or either one, you know? And so there's some debate about whether or not uh, this theology of resurrection, of a mass resurrection, was
Mhm.
something that came along earlier or later. Borg and Crossan seemed to think it was earlier. I don't. I don't actually think that's probably accurate. I think it was
Mhm.
probably later. I don't see any evidence in the Gospel of Mark that Mark believed in that.
Mhm.
I think the fact that he doesn't mention anything on Saturday is actually really significant because
Right.
he's not
Right.
theologizing about what any of that means.
Right.
It's just nothing.
Right. I agree.
And I think sometimes
I
that's
like that.
accurate, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just nothing.
Right.
And sometimes it's just grief and sadness.
Mhm.
But the message I think that we get then is that that's not the last word.
Yay!
And so that brings us to Easter Sunday,
The big day.
the big day
Yeah, I
that
like
most
this.
Christians, I'm not sure, really understand.
I don't think so. I mean, going back to, like, how did you celebrate Easter? What did you think? What were you taught? Like, what
Well, I remember Easter eggs as a kid. That was, and I would always get an Easter basket, and it had
Yeah.
some fun stuff in it. So it was something to look forward to in the spring. But like, not quite like Christmas. I always looked
Right.
at it as like, oh man, I wish it were Christmas on Easter.
I think my kids too, the little one especially, he
Yeah.
tries to, he's like, does the Easter Bunny accept letters?
Yeah,
He's asked.
because I've noticed that the Easter Bunny is not bringing as good of presents as Santa
Yeah,
is, and he needs some help.
yeah.
Yeah, no, so, and then we would go to church, and it was all about resurrection and stuff, which
Mhm,
was a word I didn't know because that
mhm,
wasn't a word that we used in everyday life,
mhm.
and I didn't really understand what that meant.
Right.
Because there was always some intellectual, discongruence with that. I didn't understand how it was that somebody could come back from the dead. That was
Mhm.
something that never
Yeah.
I never understood. It
Yeah.
never made sense to me. And so, even though I grew up in a pretty progressive congregation,
Mhm,
that was still kind of a part of the narrative
mhm.
because, in progressive churches, we still talk about he's risen,
Right.
there's a
Right.
resurrection, the empty tomb, Christ is
Yeah.
back.
Yeah.
And I honestly would often leave Easter not quite knowing what it was or
Mhm.
what I was supposed to think.
Yeah.
And so I knew it was a joyful day, that it was like a happy day, but I also didn't understand it.
Mhm.
How
Yeah.
about you?
Same. The same thing, and I'll be honest and say the when it started to make a little bit more sense in terms of how I see resurrection now.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember way back in the day, there was this claymation, Davy and Goliath, and so it was this little dog
Okay.
and
Yeah.
this little boy, David, and always air Sunday mornings. I think at
Okay.
least where
Yeah.
we lived. I lived in Costa Rica at the time, and the Easter episode, Davy's grandma died.
Mm.
And so there's like sadness because she had
Yeah.
died. And there was this parallel with the Jesus story. And somehow in there, and I don't know if this is really how the story went, but this is how I interpreted it as
Mm.
a child was, oh, okay, like he's not going to see his grandma again. Jesus is alive, but they kind of equated it as like, the way that the grandma's always alive
Mm.
in this story, and that we have hope for that. I don't know that that's necessarily how the story went, but it made sense to me.
Mm.
And that's kind of
Mhm.
what I held on to throughout middle school, high school, when I
Yeah.
kept hearing like Jesus is risen. Yes, he's alive. Like his body wasn't there in the
Yeah.
tomb. Like he really physically resurrected. And it wasn't ever something I was really comfortable with. I felt like, I hate to say this, it's equating it like Santa. Like I knew
Yeah.
Santa didn't exist, but the
Yeah.
spirit of Santa existed to me. Um, I always held on to that little Davy and Goliath story, and it
Yeah.
started to make sense. But that's not at all what was celebrated at our
Mm.
church
Mhm.
growing up. At least, that's not what the preacher would preach about. Or
Right.
so,
Right.
yeah.
I think that Borg and Crossan give us a very helpful tool.
I love how they explain this chapter. I really do. This is one
Mm.
of my favorite topics too. So,
It's great because they tell us to see it as a parable, and we were
hmm
both talking about before this how meaningful that was to
hmm
us. Because with a parable, you don't have to ask, "Did this factually happen?" You
right,
have to ask what the meaning is,
right.
and then it doesn't matter where you land on this.
hmm
If you believe in a literal resurrection, fine.
hmm
If you don't believe in a literal resurrection, also fine. Because
Yes.
ultimately, the question is, what is this story trying to teach us? In the same
Mhm.
way that the Good Samaritan.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know a single Christian who ever says, well, was there actually a Samaritan?
That didn't happen,
That didn't
so
happen. It's
we
not
shouldn't pay
valuable,
attention to the
which, I
story.
mean, full disclosure is one of the things that we need to watch in progressive Christianity is
Mhm.
picking things apart so much that they no longer have meaning.
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
another way to say that is like not just deconstructing,
Mhm.
but reconstructing something after that. And so I think that ultimately, whether you believe in a literal or a symbolic resurrection, the point is, what's it mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Are you comfortable with that idea
I am
of the resurrection?
Yes, I am
Mm,
very comfortable with that. It took me a while also to get to that because I
yeah.
I think I was, in the back of my mind, I'm like, why do these people believe in like an actual physical resurrection? It doesn't make sense. I probably wrote it, especially in my 20s. I'm like, "Ugh, that's so high and mighty with my ideas that I thought, this is ridiculous. Like, that cannot scientifically happen. So it did not happen, and have moved to a place where, you know what, it's okay. Like, it's okay that that they believe, if somebody does believe in a physical resurrection, there is power to that. Um, but then the question that we get asked a lot, and we see this on the Progressive Christianity website or the Facebook page a lot, where people are like, well, then what's the point of Christianity if Jesus didn't die, A, for our sins, and B, if Jesus didn't physically, come alive again? What is the point of Christianity? And I think the point of Christianity is following Jesus. Regardless of what I think of a physical resurrection, I still find deep meaning in the story, in the parables, in all of Jesus's teaching, and what that means for me and for us as a church and as followers following Jesus into, carrying that cross. Like, they literally say, carry that cross. So the meaning is definitely important.
That's really important, that you can do the same thing on both sides. They can either say, well, you know what? Yes, Jesus died and was literally resurrected, and if you don't believe that, then you're full of it. And you can do the same thing on the other side to say, well, no, there's absolutely no resurrection, and you can't believe in that. It's just illogical. And so I think that the parable idea helps us to get past that. And to say it really doesn't matter, because the point is the same. And I think the point is that we are invited to participate in resurrection, that we are invited to go and follow Jesus's message in the way you were just describing today. And whenever we do, it is a form of that resurrection, that we are a part of the resurrection, that Jesus's teachings are embodied through our work. And it doesn't matter if you believe in a real physical resurrection or not, or a spiritual resurrection, or if you think it's all metaphor, that ultimately, at the end of the day, our calling is the exact same. And that is to go and follow the teachings of Jesus. I think the point of Holy Week is to ask us that question. Like, we find the path of Jesus. It begins on Palm Sunday, where people have to choose which parade they're going to go to. Are you going to march in the parade of imperialism, or are you going to march in the parade of peace through justice? And then, are you going to continue walking that path, even though it is the path that confronts the principalities and the powers, even though it is the path that has a real cost, and even though it is the path that ultimately leads to the cross? Which path are you going to walk? And I think that is the invitation of Holy Week, and I think it is the invitation of Easter. But I think Easter also then ultimately gives us hope, that without Easter, the story is empire wins. Always. The powers of this world win. And I think the message of Easter is, but that's not the way God wants it. And it doesn't have to be that way.
I agree.
And so I think that the original version of the Gospel of Mark, I actually really like. And so I understand why editors didn't want to keep it that way. The editors that came in the next century changed the ending of Mark by adding to it post-tomb stories, visions of Jesus. But the original ending ended with the woman running away scared. And I like that, because it is simply an open tomb. And it is, to me, an invitation to participate in the open tomb. And so I really love Mark's ending. It's my favorite.
I like
of
that.
all the Easter stories. Mark is my favorite, because we just get the empty tomb. We don't get any explanation of what it means. We don't find out what the women go and do. We just get the invitation, but we know what happened.
Right. That is a good writer right there. I mean, that's a good novel ends that way, right? Where it's like, oh, you can go this way, you could go that. I mean, it is he was a good writer.
He was.
But it leads us, to ask the question of ourselves. I really like that, the empty tomb.
And whenever we realize, too, that Matthew and Luke both use Mark as a source, that then we know that what they have after that, they added themselves,
Right.
that they chose to add that
Right.
in addition to what Mark had. And
Mm-hmm.
so they felt like they needed to give explanation, but that wasn't the way that Mark had chosen to end it. And
Yeah.
so I like that invitation from the empty tomb. And I think that brings us back maybe to the thing we put a pin in earlier,
Yes. Oh,
which
yeah.
is US politics
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps particularly the way that Trumpism has infected the United States and
Yeah.
how religious nationalism
Mm-hmm.
has been on the rise
Mm-hmm.
globally, and what our invitation is as Jesus followers in response to that. Do you have any thoughts on that, Marshella?
Well, as we read through the book, there are very clear parallels between the Roman Empire and, in looking at, you cannot look at US politics without carrying it abroad since we are an imperial power. But there are some very clear parallels with how we're living today. And then on top of that, some very clear parallels too with
Mm,
religious leaders who are either being used by the government or who are very clearly just standing up and just wanting to affirm what's happening in certain areas. Like but there is that parallel. Like some of our Christian, well, I shouldn't say our, but some Christian leaders
yeah.
are being used in the same way that perhaps we had other leaders, had with Caiaphas or you know.
That is a great point, Marcella. I think about, say, I think about the reproductive rights
Mm.
movement
Mm-hmm.
as a case in point. That ultimately, what those who are in political power care about, I don't think is actually whether or not people can get abortions.
Right.
They care about staying in power
Right.
and
Yeah.
manipulating the religious folks in order to keep them in power.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that we've had religious collaborators with that,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure that a lot of the people in the moral majority really have a big interest
Right.
in abortion. I think they
Yeah.
have an interest in political power in the same
Mm-hmm.
way that Caiaphas and the collaborators in Rome had that interest in
Mm-hmm.
keeping their political power. And so they then in the US galvanized people around this
I
issue
agree.
to keep these often abhorrent people in power
Mm-hmm.
to get this one issue
Yeah.
at the forefront, and
Yeah.
to ultimately get people to vote against themselves, to vote against their own self-interest, and to vote against the interests of what's best for the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that's a perfect example that you gave. I think about the imperialism of the U.S. Oppressing others in the same way that
Mm-hmm.
Rome has done, but not just the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
We see, principalities and powers doing this
All
all over
around.
the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
That we see genocide
Yeah.
happening right now.
Yeah.
We see the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
That we see domination systems
Yeah.
doing what domination systems always do, which is wanting to hold on to power,
Mm-hmm.
particularly at the expense of the most vulnerable in society.
Yeah.
And so I think our job
Mm-hmm.
as Jesus followers, the lesson from Holy Week is to say, Jesus wasn't the domination system.
No.
Even if we find ourselves participating in the domination
Mm-hmm.
system, and it's not like we can help that in a lot of
Right.
ways, but Jesus wasn't a part of the domination system. He challenged the domination systems. And so our job as Jesus followers, if we're really in the Jesus parade, is to challenge the domination systems, to
Mm-hmm.
stand on behalf of those who are marginalized,
Mm-hmm.
because the marginalized were the ones who were hanging on the cross.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Justice, liberation,
Yeah.
peace,
Yes.
and love.
Right.
Those were all, if we had a slogan for,
Eh,
for the Jesus parade, I think that would be it. You cannot have those things when you're participating in part of the domination system.
that's a great way to end this, I think, Marcella. So thanks for
This
these
was
conversations every week.
fun.
Wasn't this fun?
Yes, I love talking about this stuff
Me
and
too.
learning. I learned so much in the process.
Me too. And I think it was really reinforced for me how much we had collaboration happening in what ultimately happened to Jesus and how complicated first century
Very,
world was
very.
and how much of that we don't necessarily know without
Mhm.
real time to study
Yeah.
and think about what it means and break down the narrative that we're given by much of Christianity.
Yeah, definitely.
So
I
thanks for
think
doing this, Marshella, and thanks to all of you for taking time each week to join us as we walk through the events of Holy Week to discover who really killed Jesus.